Hello, everyone. We're so glad to have you join us. I'm Audrey Truschke, and I'm speaking today with Rohit Chopra about his book, The Gita for a Global World. So let me begin by introducing Professor Rohit Chopra. He's associate professor in the Department of Communications at Santa Clara University. His work centers on global media and cultural identity, digital media, and more recently, the poetics and politics of global music and disability in media. In addition to the Gita for a Global World that we'll be talking about today, he's the author most recently of The Virtual Hindu Nation, Saffron Nationalism, and New Media. He also writes on media, politics, society, and culture for a number of international news organizations, and he's the co-founder and co-host of the India Explained podcast. Over to you, Rohit.
All right. Thanks very much, Audrey. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks to Scroll, thanks to the good people at Westland. It is my pleasure too to introduce Professor Audrey Truschke, and I'm very, very grateful that she made the time and she was willing to participate in this event. So before we jump into the conversation, let me formally introduce Audrey. Professor Audrey Truschke is Associate Professor of South Asian History at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. She received her PhD in 2012 from Columbia University, and her research focuses on the cultural, imperial, and intellectual history of medieval and early modern India, as well as the politics of history in modern times. She is the author of 3 books and is currently working on a single-volume history of India spanning 4,000 years with the support of an NEH Public Scholars Grant. Audrey believes in talking about history outside the ivory tower, and so you could find her on Twitter, and her handle is @Audrey Truschke. All right, so I think here we are, and just a quick word of thanks to the audience. As we start the conversation, please feel free to share your questions and your comments, and what we will do is, through the course of the conversation, we'll respond to as many questions as we can, rather than just keeping them at the end.
Fantastic. So we're here to discuss this book, which is fantastic. I really enjoyed reading it. And I thought my sort of opening question essentially comes from the subtitle, right? Ethical action in an age of flux. And Rohit, I wanted to ask you, what is ethical for you, and sort of where do you get that from? And for me, right, I'm not a modernist, at least not most of the time. And so when I read and look at the Gita, generally it is in a historical context. And most readers of the Gita in pre-modernity understood this concept of nishkama karma, right? Action, without desiring the fruits of that action, or desireless action. They understood that as within the Varna system, right? Within the caste system, because a question arises: if you're not acting because you want something to happen, right? If you're not acting in pursuit of the fruits of your actions, well, then how do you know what to do? How do you know what is right? And the Varnashrama system provided that answer for a lot of people, but I don't think it's providing the answer for you. So could you talk a little bit about your vision of what is ethical and where it comes from?
Right. So it's a fantastic question. And for me, it's actually, the idea seemed profoundly contradictory. I had heard the idea growing up in India: you can't escape the Gita and you can't escape this idea, right? And as I write in the book, everything in that middle-class world of the 1980s that I grew up in seemed to be outcome-oriented. You are supposed to work hard because you want a job. You're supposed to, work for some certain number of days, a certain number of hours every day because you want to get into a good college and so on, right? That middle-class world is very competitive, examination obsessed. And yet at the same time, there was this whole sort of discourse about, do what you have to do, and don't worry about the consequences. That in itself was a kind of ethical precept, an ethical guideline for kind of living your life. So this contradiction is for me kind of the starting point. And the idea was that I found resonances of this idea in different kinds of places and different kinds of thinking. So the question became that, can this speak to our times, given that the Gita has spoken to audiences and constituencies across different points of time? And then more specifically, the question became, and I started this as a kind of open-ended inquiry, which is why I didn't restrict the analysis to a particular kind of or one particular ethical framework. So it started as an open-ended inquiry whether this idea can have any value or not, or maybe the idea doesn't have much value, precisely because of the reasons that you mentioned, which is that it is an idea that's contained within that particular Varna system. Now, I'll just share for me, what was a fascinating finding. Thanks to someone, Dr. Rajesh Oza, he's one of the interlocutors of the book. He did a long interview with me for a South Asian magazine here. I discovered that the phrase Nishkamma Karma Yoga is not anywhere in the Gita. And then I checked with other people, and then they checked with like half a dozen different Sanskritists. And, it is one of those translations that probably came in from Gandhi or from Aurobindo. That would be a interesting bit of detective work itself to do. So yes, that contradiction is there in the Gita. And my question was, how do we interpret this ethical framework in light of the challenges that, this condition of present day crisis globalization, as I call it, faces us? And I've argued that there are certain points of time where, the limits of the patriarchal order and the Varna system make it actually difficult. So I've suggested a way of working through it, but that's one interpretation and it's open to critique.
That's great. I think that's really helpful for sort of positioning where you're coming from. So you mentioned, and I agree, of course, I think we all agree, there are so many interpretations of the Gita, right? Somebody like Tilak used it to justify the use of violence in the struggle for independence. Mahatma Gandhi used it for quite the opposite, to hold up the sanctity and the essential importance of nonviolence in that same conflict. Western people have read it and have different interpretations. But it does seem to me that at least a very common thread throughout those interpretations is the presence of God, right? People are always wanting me to talk about God, by the way. So, folks, this is your chance. This is the closest I'm going to get. So, where's God? Where is divinity for you? And I'm thinking here especially about the climax of the Gita, right? Because Krishna has all kinds of arguments, and Arjuna's, kind of convinced, but not really convinced. But what really seals the deal is the divine revelation, right? When Krishna shows his divine self. So where's God for you?
So it's an excellent question. And someone could read the book and say that the argument I present actually sidesteps the issue, and I'd be open to that critique. I argue in the book that one of the things I don't want to engage with is a religious reading. And the more I think about it, and given that I've had several conversations, that's something I should have clarified more, that the kind of reading I want to set aside is a reading which invokes religious authority as kind of the final arbiter. And I think in some ways this speaks to the point that you make. In light of this revelation that Krishna shares at the end, someone asked me a very interesting question, saying that this is a gentleman who was there at one of the earlier book events, and he said that that's what Krishna says at the end, that if everything else fails, put your faith in me. And he said, in a modern world, is this a lesson that I want to give my daughter, right? Do you put your unconditional faith in someone? So in the context, when I was talking about religion, first of all, and divine authority, that's the kind of idea I wanted to set aside for two reasons. One is, as if you go down the path of Sab Bhagwan ki marzi hai, everything is the will of God, then everything can be attributed to that. But the question of divinity is not entirely inescapable, and I talk about that the metaphysical aspect or the aspect of divinity cannot exactly be kind of done away with. So the question then becomes, how do we kind of interpret divinity? And this, perhaps this is somewhat opaque in the book, and it could have been fleshed out, and I could have made that link clearer. For me, the question of divinity arises in really, transcending the limitations of the vision of the patriarchal order or the Varna order, and thinking of the divinity of the other. Because I think that in the message of the universalism of the Gita, you can find that principle, and you can use that principle to kind of make this point. And I'll just refer to an argument that Devasya Anthony, who's a philosopher and equally well-versed in the Indian and the Western tradition, said. He said, one other way to think of this is that Krishna is the higher self and Arjuna is the lower self. Now we get into the realm of metaphor and allegory there. So then that becomes a whole other interesting question about how do we read the text as an allegorical text. And I'll just share, I had a conversation with Amit Chaudhary, the Indian writer, and he's written a couple of fantastic essays on the Gita, and he wrote the introduction to this beautiful edition, which is brought out by the Folio Society. And he starts by talking about, he uses this phrase, the Gita is a book that is at war with itself. So, in that sense, I would say there are these two different understandings of divinity. But let me now take this opportunity and, sort of turn back to you, Audrey, because, I come from a very different, I'd say, position in terms of my training, and my entry into writing this book was sort of personal and so on. And you're trained as a philologist, you're a Sanskritist, Indologist, and you've now been working as a historian for a long time, so you have those perspectives. So in terms of historically understanding shifts in divinity or in ethics, or in terms of that world and the resonances of these terms, I'd be very interested in what you might have to say.
That's a very interesting question. So let me start out by saying one of the things that I found very both delightful and very thought-provoking, sometimes in slightly uncomfortable ways, to be honest, about your book, is that it forced me to think about the Gita in a way that I almost never do, right? I teach courses regularly on the history of Hinduism, and we go all 15 weeks without me ever saying or really thinking about what I think about any of this from a personal standpoint, right? That's not how I'm trained, and that's not how I choose to approach the tradition. Whereas with your book, I mean, from the first page, it's what does the Gita mean to me? Well, to you, which of course forced me to ask what it might mean to me. To get to your question about sort of shifts in divinity. So I really I like this quote, the Gita is at war with itself. And I especially like your reading that I think it's in the book, but you saying it now made it clearer to me that you can see the divinity in the other, because that is a delightfully subversive reading, in my opinion. That is not historically how most people have understood the Bhagavad Gita. But there is also something, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, there is something quintessentially and utterly Hindu about that. Because one marker of Hindu traditions, and it helps to put that in the plural sometimes, is that you can't pin them down, right? There is nothing that you can say that all Hindus believe or that all Hindus do. Even today in 2021, and you start looking back in thousands of years of history, and I mean, it's just a completely lost cause. And that inability to pin things down, right? And then that flexibility of the tradition, it's one of the great strengths of Hinduism, certainly that allowed it to survive and transform historically. And I think that also makes it speak to such a wide range of people today. If I could just say, I guess I'm sidestepping your question. But I mean, I think one of the biggest shifts, and probably one that many modern Hindus are probably unaware of in terms of perceptions of divinity, really comes about in the 19th century with the Hindu reform movements, right? Basically, a bunch of Protestants show up in India in association with the colonial mission there, and they start looking at Hinduism, and they're like, dudes, you all have too many gods. Right? More than one is too many from the Protestant perspective, at that point in time, at least. And they're like, you have too many gods, and like they have all these images and like heads and arms, and like, folks, you got to clean this up. And some Hindus resisted that, and other Hindus internalized that. And so there are a lot more Hindus today, I think, who articulate ideas about the singularity of God and are more uncomfortable with pluralities than there used to be. I have my head in pre-modern Hinduism most of the time, though, so that's hardly my perspective.
That's fascinating. I should just very quickly mention that, those different manifestations of Hinduism, if you will, are something that I'm very personally familiar with, because one set of my grandparents were Arya Samajis, which was a reform movement very much along these lines. And, the claim was that this is scientific and there is a kind of oneness, and there's, a sort of reticence about idol worship. And, I would say my other grandparents it was hard to pin down what they were, but they were very much in that, well, my grandfather was an atheist, but, also agnostic in some ways and so on. So that sort of resonates with me. All right, one of the questions I'd like to speak to, and I think when we had a kind of conversation about the book, was a question about how the Gita is often used to kind of legitimize violence and this on the one hand, it has been, whether it was anti-colonial violence in the case of Tilak, and I think I was reading, Professor Laurie Patton, who was my dissertation committee, has a wonderful own translation and an introduction where she says that I think at some point of time, if you were caught with 2 copies of the Gita, that counted as sedition under British colonial rule. But then for Gandhi, it was part of his project of non-violence. One of the things I noticed was that bringing this to the present, and it's a context that you and I are both familiar with in all kinds of ways, some not entirely pleasant, which is the way the Gita has been weaponized by the Hindu nationalists, and the same people who will have messages of universalism will also, from the Gita, will also be spewing bile against minorities and so on. And when I read your book, The Language of History, one of the sort of really fascinating things I found there was the fact that this notion of Hindu-Muslim violence, how alien it was to that earlier world. And I know we're moving a little away from the Gita, but we still are in this sort of larger universe of violence and the other. And I was just wondering if you could, speak to that sort of sensibility and vision, because a question that I get asked often is, what does the Gita have to say about violence? Because it's a book that's on the edge of war, as I put it. And particularly, one example I'm thinking of is that passage you have about how pre-modern historians recorded the battle of the Ghurids and the Chauhans, right? That it was not necessarily a Hindu-Muslim battle. So given that one of the ways the Gita has been weaponized by the Hindu right has been really to kind of, legitimize the violence against the other, I'd just be fascinated in hearing from you about that.
So the first thing that I would say is that the Gita's view on violence is all in the interpretation. Right, and this is a key thing of philology and just basic approach to text. Texts don't actually say anything until somebody reads them, right? So if you want to read the Gita and think it justifies violence, that's your interpretation. If you want to read the Gita in the Mahatma Gandhi way, then that's your interpretation, right? So the text intrinsically doesn't say anything. It's all about context and interpretation. But sort of pivoting then to talk about other ways of thinking. So we've been talking about the Gita as a Hindu text, but I mean, a fair question to ask is it really a Hindu text, right? Like what is involved in that term Hindu? Certainly for the majority of time in history that the Bhagavad Gita has been in existence as a Sanskrit text, people have not referred to it as a Hindu text. Okay, that term was just not in use widely to refer to Hinduism really until the 18th century and later. As far as I know, it wasn't used self-referentially at all until probably the 15th century at the earliest. So was it really a Hindu text? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a very complicated question. It depends on how you look at it. But one thing that I can tell you is that other people looking at situations that today we would automatically say, those people are Hindu, those people are Muslim, that's Hindu-Muslim conflict. People at the time didn't see it that way at all. So to give just the example that Rohit alluded to, in the late 12th century, the Ghurids roll in. Right, they're coming originally from Central Asia and Iran, what's now Iran, and they're sort of moving into northern India, and they encounter not the Indian Empire, because there never was an Indian Empire, folks. There was never political unity in that way in pre-modernity. They encountered the Chauhans, okay, who are a sort of small-time-ish empire in the north, and they fight. They fight 2 battles. 1191 and 1192. The first time the Chauhans win, and the second time the Ghurids win. Hence the beginning of Indo-Muslim or Indo-Persian rule. And there is a Sanskrit text about the first battle where the Chauhans win. And reading this text, it's written in Sanskrit by a Brahmin who was working for the Chauhan court. And reading it, one thing that I'm really struck by is this guy, Jayanika is his name. He says basically like everything about the Chauhans and the Ghurids, except that they're Hindu and Muslim. That's like nowhere in the text. He wouldn't have used the term Hindu in any case. And he doesn't identify the Ghurids as Muslim in any identifiable way. And that's such a contrast to today. Because today, I'm guessing that most people listening to this can't say anything about the Ghurids and the Chauhans except that they are Muslim and Hindu, respectively. Right? So we sort of come full circle in a sense, or half circle. maybe we should come full circle, and maybe we should try to transcend some of the sort of monolithic religious identities that define the terms of our world. Whether you want to do that or not, some of us do, some of us do not. The story overall can be a reminder that the way we think about our religious identities, as well as by extension our religious texts today, it's not permanent. It's not time immemorial. It's not going to last forever, right? Change is the only constant of life. And so what is and is not Hindu will continue to evolve and change, whether we think of the Gita as a Hindu text or more like Rohit does, as a text that can offer ethical insight into how we live today, regardless of how you think of divinity, right? Or thinking of divinity in a very different way, that is also possible.
Thank you, Audrey. And we'll take a couple of questions, but I just wanted to speak to that. And I think, it's very interesting that in some ways, I'm actually working on a piece in secularism, and I'll come to that later. I know that it's an anachronistic word to use in the pre-modern context, but I really wonder if that, the kind of imagination which doesn't pin identities down into Hindu and Muslim can be called a form of, pre-modern secularity. And one of the gestures I make in the book, and I call it a gesture because it's something for us to think about, is really that, yes, we will read the text in different ways. And one of the ways the text will be read is as Hindus. And the dominant way the text comes to so many of us, including me, as you pointed out, is through what its identity has been in the Indian context for the last 100, 150 years, but also as a sort of globally known text. So in one way, your comments provincialized for me, my own perspective, which has been enormously illuminating. But I say that we also should make the text, and I don't know how we do this, but it's, so it's a kind of utopian impulse, but we need to secularize access to the text, and we need to free it from the clutches of the Hindu right, and we need to open it up to critique and criticism, which I don't think is, in the larger historical scheme, inconsistent, even with the tradition of Hinduism. And I'm finding all kinds of fascinating things. My mom sent me a lovely video from, I think, BBC on Ambedkar, and I just found this out 2 days ago, and I'm really fascinated by this, that Ambedkar was very critical of the Gita, said it was like the Bible for Hindus, and apparently Birla, the Indian industrialist, offered Ambedkar money to not criticize the Gita. I think that's there in one of the videos my mom sent me, either the BBC one or some other one. So I have to check the veracity. But that to me is a really interesting question. And I think if we free this, it's a very interesting question. What does it mean for something to be a Hindu text or a Christian text? All right. I'm going to read out a few questions, and then I'll take a quick crack at them. And then, Audrey, it'd be lovely to have your response too. So Gloria asks, is the presence of God a limiting factor for scholarly interpretations? Avni asks, can you tell us about the inspiration for writing this book, as the Gita is also available in multiple languages? Arsalan Sheikh says, thanks for the awesome discussion. How are we supposed to marry modernity with the Gita in particular and holy texts in general, or should we? He says he's writing as someone inspired by Nietzsche's nihilism. And Zorawar Bajwa says, challenge to Indian liberals, criticize Islam and Quran also. There are many flaws there, violence against women, non-Muslims, unscientific claims, etc. All excellent questions. So Gloria's question, I think I've already spoken a little bit about, how I see God in hermeneutic terms, or, how the presence of God sort of plays a role in an interpretive framework. And, perhaps that may reflect my own limitations, or, some deep-seated unease with religious or theological argument, which is something that I'm open to critique about. But I think this would be a really good question for Audrey to speak to. Very briefly about my inspiration, it's I discovered that I'd not been particularly interested in religion or in the Gita, but I discovered at some point of time it was a text that I just knew so much about because it had been everywhere in the air. And shortly after I came to the US, I'd been here about a couple of years, graduate student in Atlanta. Everyone who comes from another country, you would experience bouts of homesickness. I would buy pirated copies of Indian cricket tapes for $5 each, I remember, and watch those. And I remember going to Borders, buying a few books. My wife and I were going to be traveling back to India, and I saw Barbara Stoler Miller's edition of the Gita. And I started reading it in Borders, and I was just completely transfixed. And so much of it, I kind of recognized from things my father and mother had said, or that were all in the air. So last year, in the context of the pandemic, I realized we were in a crisis. And I just started thinking that this is a book about a crisis. And so that for me was the kind of inspiration. Now, Arsalan's question about modernity with the Gita in particular, I think you have to accept it is sort of a text that is not entirely compatible with political values we attach to modernity. Now, how do we go about it? You can read the text in its own time, where I think you kind of, reserve political judgment, if you will. Or if it is a text that you want to be relevant, there's no way around the fact that it's a text that is consistent with the inequalities of the caste system or the patriarchal order. I mean, there are all those passages in the opening chapter where, the point is that, when if women are not within a certain order of control, which reflects divine harmony, the whole sort of order of the universe falls down. Now, it's interesting. I'll combine this with the other question about challenge to Indian liberals, criticize Islam and Quran also. One of my inspirations methodologically is actually from the work of a teacher of mine, Professor Abdullahi An-Naim. He translated a book by a teacher of his. It's called The Second Message of Islam. Now, in Islam, there's the Mecca and the Medina message, and I don't know which one comes first. But the first message of the Prophet actually talks about equality for women, and it talks about no distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims in any which way. The passages that people often cite as, in some ways reflecting notions of inequality in the Quran, or patriarchy, guardianship over women, and so on. And then what the Prophet does is he abrogates that message. I think he abrogates the Mecca message or the Medina message. And Ustad Mahmud Taha, who was an intellectual in Sudan, and he was actually hanged by the Numeri regime for this, says that in the modern world, we need to abrogate these passages and we need to go back to that original message of equality, which the Prophet had reversed given particular historical conditions. And inspired by that, Abdullahi An-Naim's project is essentially to look at, what you need to do is you need to sort of in some ways desacralize aspects of Sharia. And it's extremely relevant what he says, given what's happening with Afghanistan and the Taliban today. And Abdullahi An-Naim goes on to argue why the Islamic State is conceptually incoherent. And one of his arguments for saying that these passages need not to have this kind of religious transcendental authority is that it becomes impossible to, in fact, contest them, because then you get accused of heresy and blasphemy. And he has an absolutely wonderful line, which I think he shared in his book or in one of the many conversations I had with him over the years. He said, remember that not every heresy, every orthodoxy started out as a heresy. Right? Not every heresy becomes an orthodoxy, but every orthodoxy started out as a heresy. So, I think that's a kind of impetus that we can look at. Now, about Indian liberals, I think one of the ways in which this demonization of Indian liberals, and I'm not suggesting, Zorawar, that this is what you're saying, has taken place is that, they don't criticize Muslims, they don't criticize minorities, etc. I don't actually think that's true. And I can give you any number of examples. When Shirin Dalvi, the editor of an Urdu weekly a couple of years ago, said that we shouldn't ban Charlie Hebdo's publication, or I think she may have published those. There were calls for her for attacking and assaulting her. And I think that people spoke out about that. The Shah Bano case is a whole other can of worms, but, Indian liberals did speak out for Shah Bano's rights. Or, more recently, I'm thinking of Taslima Nasreen. So this idea that, Indian liberals speak selectively on Hinduism is, I think, probably a little simplistic. Audrey, I'll leave it to you because I don't want to keep going on. And then I don't know if there are other questions you want to sort of... Raphael says the Mecca message comes first. So thank you very much, Raphael. Thank you for that. So I'll just leave it to you, Audrey, about divinity and Indian liberals, etc.
Well, I'm gonna leave liberals alone there, but let me talk about divinity. So is the positing of God, is that a limit to scholarly interpretation? I think that the essential answer is no, right? I mean, we couldn't have philosophy departments, essentially, if we couldn't talk about theories of God, like much Western philosophy and Eastern philosophies, for that matter, sort of posit and assume that and argue about that. I think that I don't want to approach this. scholars, there are a lot of different ways to be a scholar, right? And so, I mean, you're seeing too on the screen here. I mean, Rohit is approaching the Gita in a much more sort of personal and kind of wrestling with it way in a modern context versus how I approach it as, slightly more at distance and much more interested in historical interpretations. And there are a whole range of people that are between us and beside us. You can be a scholar in a lot of different ways, and your sort of position on divinity and what you're willing to admit and what sorts of arguments you're interested in engaging with. All of that is sort of highly variable. I would also just point out, so a major way that this comes up for me is in the classroom, right? And I mean, Rohit, I'm sure, has his own set of experiences, right? When you're teaching college students, a lot of college students, they're trying to figure out who they are and who they want to be, what they think, what they believe, what their politics are. And people are at different places, right? Some people have decided what they think about religion, and that has, no place in the classroom. And others will have a crisis of faith sitting in your lecture. And that's fine. That's all great. And the job of professors is not to tell students, how that should turn out, but to offer them resources and sort of lead them. So I have definitely had students sort of wrestle with the question of God, usually within the context of their own religion, right? When I'm teaching on Hindu texts. And sometimes their own religion is Hinduism, and sometimes it's something different. And that's all sort of within the college experience. In terms, let me now turn to sort of the Gita and modernity, right? And does the Gita have a place in the modern world? I would ask a different question. How can the Gita not have a place in the modern world? Right? I don't really think we have much of a choice here. The Gita is important, is a critical text to sort of paraphrase, possibly directly quote colleagues of mine. Religion isn't done with you. You might be done with religion, but religion is not done with you yet. Religion permeates our world. It is a critical part of it. You may dislike that, but reality doesn't really care that much about your feelings, okay? So the Gita is part of our modern world, whether you want it to be or not. And so the question is, what are you going to do about that? You could try to ignore it, but I would say you do that at your peril. One, you probably end up illiterate in terms of religion. And this is something that I push relentlessly in the classroom and public education, in my scholarship, is religious literacy. You don't have to believe in it, but you should know something about major world religions and what people believe and what they think and what the key texts are, just to sort of understand everything from basic, phrases in our language to sort of where general groups of people tend to be coming from. I think religious literacy is really, really important. I also think, thinking from sort of somewhat more of an internal standpoint, if you were born in India, if you were raised there, maybe especially if you're Hindu, maybe especially if you're certain kinds, you come from certain places and positions within the broad range of Hindu traditions, the Gita's around you, right? And Rohit described that from his perspective. So what are you going to do with that? Right? You can criticize the text, you can reject it, you can embrace it, you can reinterpret it. There are a lot of different options, but you have to do something with it. Right? The Gita may not be done with you yet. But on that note, sort of one question that I do want to bring up, and I'd love to hear Rohit's thoughts on this, is what about Hindu text beyond the Gita? Right? There's a lot of Hindu text out there. I mean, Rohit, you shared this quote that, the Gita is the Bible for modern Hindus. I mean, I think that there's a lot of truth in that, but there's a lot of other Hindu texts, right? What about the Ramayana? What about the entire Mahabharata? What about the Yoga Vasishta? So on and so forth. The Vedas. Right? Could you have done this with other Hindu texts? Did it have to be the Gita? Could you talk a little bit about this?
Wonderful question. And I should just clarify that I was just quoting Ambedkar there, and I take your point well, that there is a sort of, you see where Ambedkar's coming from, and there's a kind of validity to that, but it doesn't sort of exhaust the world of Hindu texts. So I think absolutely. I think, one of the great, now could I have done it, or could it be done? I'm going to treat those as separate questions. Could I have done it? Probably not, because it's above my pay grade. I'm not trained in this area. Sure, I think there are certain kinds of things I could have done. There have been some really fascinating studies, for instance, of the Amar Chitrakatha series, and the Amar Chitrakatha was my introduction to so much of Indian history and so much of Indian mythology. And I loved it. And, you look at it in sort of very interesting and complicated ways. It shapes your kind of understanding. So I'm, I'm in a media studies and communication department. So if I were to look at Hindu texts, I might look at it through the prism of popular culture. I could do something on, all the wonderful work that so many people have done. I think Kajal Jain, is it? Christopher Penny on, Hindu visual culture. That's another thing that fascinates me. So there would be certain things I could do, and there would be certain things I wouldn't, unless, I spend years getting the training and familiarizing myself. And for the Gita, there was a very particular kind of interest for me, which kind of opened that world out. And then I kind of struggled through it. But should it be done? I think absolutely. I absolutely think so. And I think, what would one come up with? I mean, would one find the Manusmriti, for instance, as relevant to the modern world? Maybe not. I mean, I think in some ways the violence in terms of caste identity is so much more pronounced, right? It's hard to compare violence. It's hard to say X is more discriminatory than Y, because, how do you sort of measure suffering or violence or brutality? But I think in terms of, prescriptions, it's a much, more difficult text to kind of grapple with. But in general, and I think this speaks to the point you made earlier, I think, absolutely, I love what, these two quotes you said, and I teach at a Jesuit school, and I went to a Jesuit college. So this is very resonant because, in the classroom, I have complete freedom and autonomy, and I'm free to criticize religion, and I appreciate that. But we tend to have a lot more events, pertaining to questions of, for instance, the human spirit, technology, and God, or that you may not have in other kinds of universities. So religion, you may be done with religion, but religion's not done with you. You can't escape religious literacy. I think these are like really central questions. So in that sense, one of the things I will point to is that I think in the post-independence era, there was there was a kind of unease with religion in the Indian public sphere and the Indian educational sphere for all kinds of reasons. I think part of it had to do with the sort of violence of bloodshed. And while on the one hand, ideologically, we defined Indian secularism as equidistant from all religions, not so much separation of religion and church or religion and state. There was, I think, a whole kind of thinking about treating religion as this category that was in some ways problematic and backward, and it wasn't a mover of modernity, right? It was the residual pre-modern. And I think, I want to say Ranajit Guha, and maybe I think Dipesh Chakravarti actually has a really interesting critique of is it Sumit Sarkar, the historian Sumit Sarkar, who's written like a fantastic modern book. But, one of the things he points to is that religion keeps coming back as this sort of atavistic force. Now, when you bracket off a whole number of religious texts as, the voice of atavism and not modernity, I think you really lose out. You really lose out a lot. So the specific question of how these texts speak to us in terms of modernity, what the outcome of those critical examinations will be, I don't know. Should it be an exercise we should undertake, difficult as it is? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there is a richer tradition, my sense is, of doing it with Christianity in the Western context itself. And of course, in India, religious texts get tied up with larger political things. So then, there are bans and Section 153 and 295A. But let me flip that back to you. We'll take a few more questions. And what would your thoughts be about, how do we open up this sort of universe to the modern critical and scholarly mind and public discourse?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you clarified and said explicitly that you teach at a Jesuit institution, because of course I teach at a state university, which is avowedly secular. So I would imagine that religion comes into both our students' lives in the classroom in rather different ways. So for me, I kind of love religion. Right. I always have. Religion is the most longstanding interest in my life. That doesn't mean I'm not critical of religion. I have fierce criticisms of every religion I have ever encountered. But for me, I guess it's never been an option personally to just completely disavow it. And so the next best thing for a scholar, if you can't walk away from something, well, you just study the heck out of it. Right. And so, I mean, in a sense, I'm a historian. I work on empire. I work on culture, but I've never really been able to get away from studying religion as well, right? And I mean, Hinduism, Islam, and Jainism are the sort of three specific traditions I tend to work on these days. Let me say something about the Hindu texts. So think about the Bhagavad Gita and Manusmriti, right? The Manava Dharma Shastra, as Sanskritists tend to call it. So I think that whereas the Bhagavad Gita is often held up, and Rohit, you hold it up this way, and I think this is a completely fair reading, as universal in a sense, right? There's at least many readings that can universalize that text and see a universal message. I would hold up Manusmriti as almost the opposite, right? There is no universalizing that work. It is specific and contextual. And you even think about violence. I mean, the violence of the Gita that it's trying to confront, that's a violence we all know. Everyone knows war, right? There are not that many things that cut across all human experience and civilizations, and war is one on that short list. Whereas for Manusmriti, the violence is kind of within this circumscribed, idealized, many think in Manusmriti, caste system and Varna and all of this stuff. If you don't know quite a bit about Indian and Hindu culture at the time, it's a completely illegible text. And that demonstrates the kind of range of traditions. And I think that's probably, in terms of making texts accessible today and relevant to us, some religious texts, some parts of religious texts are going to be more accessible, some less. I would emphasize that from the point of view of history of religions, you don't get to pick and choose, right? So, in terms of how you want to live as a modern Hindu, obviously, like cherry pick away. That is the prerogative of everyone who is internal to a tradition. Make your religion what you want it to be. But, and I point this out explicitly because this is something that I am criticized for fairly relentlessly, is that I study and teach about the history of Hinduism, warts and all, so to speak, because I have to, right? That's part of what it means to be an ethical scholar who works on the history of religions, is that you don't look away when it's something that most people in the 21st century would prefer not to think about so much, such as caste-based violence.
Well, thank you very much. It's really got me thinking, and maybe one of the questions we could come back to is the difference between trying to universalize these texts and trying to understand them in their own time. And I'm thinking sort of categoristically of, there's a recent translation of the Gospels that's come out, apparently, and I forget who the scholar is, but I plan to get it because one of the reviews I read about it says that unlike many other translations of the Gospels, which are also excellent, what this does is it uses sort of the language that's very close to the original time. And what that brings to us is A, a humor, and B, it tells us something about the marvelous strangeness. And, one of the things I thought about was that in trying to make this text contemporary in some ways, right? Do you lose some of the magic and the beauty, of the original? Now, I'm not a Sanskritist, but I'll tell you specifically with regard to the Gita where I'm coming from. I'm not a Sanskritist, but what I did is that there are some wonderful online resources, and, just hats off to all the people who spend hours of their time doing this. There are transliterations with the Sanskrit and then English, and I can read Nagari script, so I was working backwards. But when I was reading Laurie Patton's translation, one of the things that comes up in the Gita time and again is, I'm amazed at the number of times people refer to how wonderful Arjuna's hair is. Krishna calls him, oh, thick-haired one, oh, one with the lustrous hair. So anyway, that's just a slightly tangential kind of thing, but it really is a small sort of fact that, kind of caught my fancy. And I really wonder about all the sort of resonances and nuances in all kinds of ways that we miss out. So a quick clarificatory...
Can I jump in
please,
on that?
Please.
So, okay, this is a matter of intense debate. Not intense debate, sort of actually very calm and muddled debate, as Sanskritists tend to be calm and muddled. Among Sanskritists is what to do with all the epithets, right? Because if you just translate the epithets, like literally nobody has any idea what's going on except the Sanskritist, which doesn't always bother us. Like, that's okay. Like, we're okay. But if you don't translate the epithets and you just replace it, like in the Gita with Krishna and Arjuna, yeah, you miss out on a lot. It doesn't sound like it does in the original. This is one of the questions that's been asked, how is language a barrier to religious literacy? And I'm not a purist on this point, but I have purist tendencies, shall we say. I strongly believe in the importance of language training. The Gita is really different when you read it in Sanskrit. And that's not to say you can't access it in other languages. Of course you can, and I think you should, right? I teach the Gita in English. I teach Stoller Miller's translation. Many of us love that translation, even though there's been so many since. But there's really no replacement for learning original languages. If I could just make a quick plug, one thing that learning languages, pre-modern languages, gives you access to is like all the stuff beyond the Gita, because 99.9% of Sanskrit text, I'm estimating, are not translated into English, right? The vast majority of that tradition is not available in English, right? So you have to learn the original if you want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rohit.
And, no, not at all. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like it's coming back to that Nishkama Karma Yoga, I've had so many conversations with the many people I've had like discussions with about the book. And one of the things in Sanskrit that Professor Herman Tull, I think he's retired now, he mentioned is, he said, it's not an easy passage, right? So, now Wittgenstein, the meaning of a word is its use for, in a large majority of cases, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. So Nishkama Karma Yoga has become part of the meanings of the Gita, but you go back to the original, it's not easy. You are entitled to, what you can do to actions, but not to the outcome or fruit of those actions. And then there is the word adhikara. And I had a long conversation with someone about all the resonances of the word adhikara. What does adhikara mean? Right, obligation, duty, so on. So yeah, and I, my background actually before I did my PhD was literature. So I, in some ways, have that kind of, formalist, close reading impulse and very closely looking at language as well. So I'll just answer a couple of quick questions and we can then proceed. Vandana asks, we are not lawyers. Please explain the sections you referred to. Yeah. So section 153 and 295A are the two sections which collectively talk about, in creating either sort of, offending another religion or creating discord between different groups. And one of them actually was, I think, articulated in response during colonial era times to a book that was about the life of, supposed to be about the life of Prophet Muhammad, which had led to riots and so on. So these are colonial era laws, and they have a complicated legacy, and they're often used to kind of shut down discussion of books, ban books, but they're also weaponized more often than not by political parties or by religious organizations to harass and intimidate, whether it's journalists or individuals. I mean, I remember many years ago, I'm a cricket fan, and it's the sort of vestigial nationalist in me is delighted that we beat England in a recent cricket test. So, speaking of atavistic impulses, but Mahendra Singh Dhoni, at some point of time, I think he had cut a cake with either Lord Vishnu or Saraswati's image in it, and someone filed a case against him. So that's the history of those two sections, and we can have a whole long conversation about censorship. Now, there's Akshay asks, Akshay Wagmare suggest points to create peace in the world behind the religious reason. Try to cover points of Bhagavad Gita also. Vinaya, the Gita claims to be a textbook on the science of the absolute and Upanishad and yoga text. Questions of Arjuna represent the anterior position, which is revalued in the Gita. It's a very specific question, Vinaya. I think much of this is, again, I would say beyond my level of expertise. But something I could try to talk to later if you want to just email me or email Professor Truschke. Ajay, isn't it incumbent on scholars to translate for access? Despite the list and translation issues, it might even motivate common people to learn pre-modern languages to fully appreciate the original. No reason to answer, just an observation. I'm just going to very quickly speak to a couple of points. Akshay, it's a huge sort of undertaking about what we can do, but to create peace in the world and the role that text could play. I'll just speak very briefly to one small thing that, one of the things I've said is that one way we interpret the doctrine of Nishkama Karma Yoga, it very clearly is not about indifference, although there is a term, I think, I forget the term, Amartya Sen had used it. There is a sort of philosophical position about indifference in the Indian tradition too. I look at it as a distinction between outcomes and consequences. And by the way, I apologize for some minor flickering light. that's going on. California is facing crazy wildfires, and there's all kinds of like weird electrical stuff happening. So, I make the distinction. So one of the things I would say is that, even if we think of this idea that you can't control outcomes, or the fact that divesting yourself of the desire to control outcomes is a utopian kind of aspiration, if you think about the consequences of your different actions, that, who are the different people who will be hurt by this, right? Or you think in terms of who are others, like for Arjuna, as I say, that the world of the sort of other, he is worried about going to war or committing violence against his kin, but that doesn't really apply to those who are not his family. And that, I think, was Gandhi's critique, that he's not opposed to violence per se, he's opposed to violence against his family members. And I think one of the ways to think about it is that if we extend that principle of kinship to others, regardless of their identities, right? And if we also think in non-anthropocentric terms, now with, the violence of development, modernity, what we have done to the world, that could be one way in which we take a small step towards that. And I know that that's in some ways a deeply unsatisfactory answer. Isn't it incumbent on scholars? Ajay, I would agree completely. I do think that, again, that is, I'm extremely uncomfortable with this idea that any work on religion, whichever religion, somehow automatically strengthens the hand of the right? That you are, and I think one of the problems for this is that, I don't want to blame Nehru for it, because as I once commented, I call the BJP the blame Jawaharlal party for everything that's gone wrong in India, and I'm not doing that here. But I think with Nehru's obsession on science and scientism, and the Indian middle class obsession about being modern, right, and bracketing religion as backward, if people are obsessed with accounting, engineering, law, medicine, etc., one of the things that did suffer was the study of the humanities and the arts and religion and tradition, right? Again, I'm quoting Amit Chaudhary, whose writing I love, and he says that we have probably forgotten how important the arts are to the secular imagination. So absolutely, I think that we would benefit as a society from, deeper investment in this. And I know that some Indian families, like in the Murthy family, has started a series of books at Harvard and so on. I don't want to keep talking. There's another question. I'll leave it. And if Audrey has that, and then I do have a question for Audrey too. How does one universalize readings of the Gita outside of the Hindutva industrial complex? This is a fantastic question. I asked this specifically in the context of the increasing use of anti-colonial language in the interest of militant nationalist impulse. I have a lot to say, but I want Audrey to speak to this. Absolutely right. They've mobilized this language, and I think it's something that needs to be called out.
So briefly on translations, I would say we are working on this. I would direct you to the Murthy Classical Library of India, which is actively translating texts from numerous languages and printing them en face with the original on the opposite page. So if you kind of know it, you can get a little bit there. But let me really comment on Hindutva reading. So I would say a couple of things. One way to get out of this is to go back in time and to learn more about history. The Bhagavad Gita has been around for roughly 2,000 years. Hindutva is a footnote when you think about that vast time period. There have been all sorts of interpretations and thoughts and commentaries and translations, modern and pre-modern, of the Gita that have absolutely nothing to do with Hindu nationalism. So learn more about the broader history, and it will help you sort of put Hindutva in its rightful place as this incredibly modern and sort of in the vast tradition, aberrant thing, and also give you some sense of how you might move beyond it as well. In terms of the Hindutva use of sort of decolonization and anti-colonial language, so I mean, this is like doublespeak from 1984. It just doesn't work. And if I can just say briefly, the fundamental reason why it doesn't work is that Hindutva is a creation of the colonial world, and it has never moved beyond and transcended those roots, and it really cannot, because Hindutva is fundamentally an authoritarian enterprise. And their reliance on colonial era ways of thinking, we see this come out in 1,000 different ways. And I'll just give the example of recent syllabi that have been released in India that claim to be teaching a more kind of proud version of Hindu civilization. And honestly, it's just straight up colonial propaganda. It's like they just turned back the clock 100 years and did nothing, because that is what Hindutva is. So the Hindu right, they can use the language of decolonization all they want, but it is a complete and total farce. They are the ones promoting bad colonial era ideas and trying to shut down scholars like Rohit and myself that are actively and actually decolonizing.
Wonderful. So we are running right about, at time. And I think that's a really powerful statement and a very good place to conclude the conversation. I'll just end with one statement, and then Audrey, if you have a concluding remark, we can just, stop there. I would just say that, in response to some of the questions people have asked, I'm just one reader, one interpreter among others. I don't have any special authority. So I would just say, regardless of, your background, whether you're Hindu or not, identify as Hindu or not, claim these texts as your own and write on them and engage with them. They belong to you as much as to anyone else. So I'll just leave it at that. And over to you, Audrey, for a final thought.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that texts, no matter where they're from in the world, they're human heritage. They belong to us all. So read them, think about them, learn from them, and use them to help formulate your own ideas so that you can go out empowered to create the world that you want to live in.
All right. Thanks very much, Audrey. And thanks to Scroll, and thanks to my publishers, Westland.